My name is Arnold Pierce, and I turned 81 this spring, though lately I have begun to feel as if time itself has stopped counting me. I wake up every morning in the same house where my wife and I lived for 42 years, a low white bungalow with creaking floors and wallpaper that has faded into the color of old paper. I still sleep on my side of the bed, leaving hers untouched, a small island of silence beside me. When the dawn light comes through the thin curtains, it looks almost the same as it did when Marjorie was alive, but the room feels larger now, emptied of conversation, emptied of purpose. I move slower than I used to, but I try to keep my routines. I boil water in the same dented kettle, grind the same beans she used to buy from the corner store, and pour my coffee into her favorite blue mug because I can't stand the sight of it sitting useless on the shelf. The mornings are long, the air thick with that quiet that only old houses know, something between memory and dust. Most days pass in small repetitions. I take my pills, make toast, read the newspaper, though I often realize halfway through an article that I have been staring at the same line for minutes. I still mow the lawn myself, though the neighbors offered to help. It gives me a reason to feel necessary, and that feeling is rare at my age. The mailbox brings little except bills, insurance reminders, and glossy brochures about assisted living communities that look more like hotels than homes. I throw them away immediately. I have always been proud of my independence, though I know that pride in the old often looks like stubbornness to the young. My daughter, Melissa, calls it that, stubbornness, when she visits, which, until recently, wasn't very often. She lives just 20 minutes away, but used to find excuses. The kids, her job, traffic, her back pain. I learned not to ask. Melissa was our only child. Marjorie and I had her late, when we were already in our 40s, and for a long time she was the bright center of our world. She was clever, restless, ambitious, qualities that made us proud, when she was young and wary when she became an adult. After Marjorie's death 5 years ago, Melissa came around a little more, always busy but polite, her hugs brief, her voice full of practiced warmth. At first, I thought it was kindness. I wanted to believe she was worried about her old father living alone. But sometimes, when she looked around the house, I caught that flicker in her eyes, the same one realtors have when they measure square footage. Still, she was my daughter, and I wanted to hold on to the illusion that family meant safety. The truth is, I started to feel strange long before any of this began. Tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. Food lost its taste, my hands trembled a little, and I felt dizzy after meals. I blamed age, weather, or the medicine my doctor kept adjusting. But sometimes I wondered if it was loneliness itself that was eating at me. I'd walk through the rooms of this house and hear echoes of conversations that no longer existed. The silence pressed on me until I'd turn on the radio, just to hear another human voice. Nights were the hardest. I would sit in my chair, the one with the worn armrest where Marjorie's hand used to rest, and stare at the clock, listening to its slow heartbeat. There were evenings when I caught myself talking aloud, asking questions to no one. Maybe that's how old people begin to fade, one conversation at a time, until all that's left is their own voice, bouncing off the walls. Then, out of nowhere, Melissa began calling more often. At first, it was once a week, then every few days. Her tone changed, softer, almost tender. She asked about my meals, my medication, my sleep. She told me she worried about me forgetting to turn off the stove, about the stairs being too steep. She said she'd been reading articles about senior accidents. I told her I managed fine, but she'd sigh and say, "Dad, you don't have to pretend for me." I wanted to believe that it was concern, that she finally saw me not as a burden, but as her father again. She started dropping by with groceries, cleaning supplies, even vitamins I hadn't asked for. I'd thank her, and she'd smile that careful smile people use when they've already decided what's best for you. One afternoon, she arrived with a casserole dish, and the smell filled the whole kitchen, rich and comforting, just like Marjorie's old recipes. Melissa said she'd found Mom's handwritten notes in a drawer and thought we could bring back some family tradition. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Melissa used to do her homework, and for a moment I could almost forget how many years had passed. She talked about her work, about the stress, about the cost of living. I listened, nodding, grateful simply to hear a voice echoing through the house. She laughed a few times, and I realized I hadn't heard her laugh like that in years. After dinner, I felt lightheaded, a slow wave of nausea rolling through me. Melissa said it was probably the salt or my medication and insisted I sit down while she washed the dishes. I didn't argue. That night, as I lay in bed, the room spinning slightly, I thought of the casserole and the way she had watched me eat. Her eyes calm but focused, as if studying the result of something. I told myself I was being foolish. Suspicion is the cruelest symptom of aging. It makes you doubt the ones you love most. But still, I couldn't shake the unease. The next morning, she called to check how I was feeling. When I said I was fine, she sounded almost disappointed. "You should rest more," she said. "Maybe I should stay with you for a few days, just to help out." I hesitated, but then agreed. It had been years since I'd shared the house with anyone. Part of me hoped that her presence would chase away the loneliness. She arrived the next day with suitcases and a basket of groceries, moving through the house as if it already belonged to her. She opened the windows, rearranged the medicine cabinet, threw away half of what was in the refrigerator. I wanted to protest, but she said gently, "Dad, it's for your own good. Some of these things are expired." That first evening, she cooked again. Chicken soup, fresh bread, chamomile tea. I sat at the table watching her move about the kitchen, and for a brief, foolish moment, I felt like the years had reversed themselves, that I was the one being cared for again. She asked about my will, about the house, about whether I had considered setting up automatic transfers for bills, so you don't have to worry about forgetting. The questions were casual, even practical, but something about the sequence made me uneasy. I told her everything was in order. She smiled, said she was proud of me for being so organized. Later that night, when I went to take my evening pills, I noticed the bottles were neatly lined up, labels facing forward, but one of them was different. The pills inside looked smaller, whiter, almost chalky. Melissa must have replaced them, I thought, maybe with a generic version. I told myself not to be paranoid. Still, I didn't take them that night. I set them aside, pretending I had. When she came by in the morning, she asked if I'd slept well and if I remembered to take all my medicine. Her tone was casual, but her eyes searched my face, waiting for confirmation. I nodded and said yes. She smiled again, that same small, patient smile that people reserve for those they think are fading. Over the next few days, my body felt weaker. My hands shook when I tried to pour coffee. My appetite disappeared. Sometimes my heart fluttered oddly, a faint drumming in my chest that made me pause and catch my breath. Melissa blamed stress and age. She insisted on cooking every meal herself and grew irritated when I tried to help. She said the kitchen was too dangerous, with all the sharp knives and slippery floors. I watched her move confidently between the counter and the stove, humming a tune that I couldn't recognize. The smell of her food filled the air. Garlic, butter, something sweet underneath. and I realized how completely she had taken control of my little world. I told myself it was only temporary, that she was helping. Yet deep down, a quieter thought stirred, the kind that hides in the corners of reason. What if help isn't always kindness? What if care can disguise something else entirely? That night, when I lay awake listening to the ticking clock, the house felt different, almost alert, as if it too sensed something amiss. I turned toward the empty side of the bed and whispered into the darkness, "Marjorie, if you're somewhere near, give me a sign." But of course no sign came, only the faint rustle of leaves outside the window and the sound of my own breathing, slow and uncertain, in a house that no longer felt like mine. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon that looked like any other. The sky low and gray, a thin drizzle tapping the kitchen windows, while Melissa moved about the house with a confidence that made me feel like a guest in my own home. She had been staying with me for nearly a week by then, and I was trying my best to accept the disruption, telling myself that this was what family was supposed to look like in old age: shared space, small compromises, a daughter caring for her father. Yet something in the air that day felt wrong, as if the house itself had begun to resist her presence. She had started locking certain drawers, saying she was organizing my paperwork, and she kept my phone on the counter whenever she cooked, insisting that I shouldn't strain my eyes scrolling. It seemed like small things at first, gestures of overprotection, but they accumulated like dust, settling into every corner of my routine. That morning she had taken the car keys, saying the brakes needed checking. When I said I could call the mechanic myself, she smiled and said, "Dad, you don't have to worry about these things anymore. Let me handle it." There was an undertone in her voice, gentle, reassuring, and absolute, that made it impossible to argue without feeling ungrateful. Around noon she made lunch, a thick stew with herbs that filled the kitchen with warmth. She insisted I eat in the living room, somewhere comfortable, while she served me. I remember the bowl, the color of clay, steam rising from the surface in slow ribbons. She brought a tray, set it down carefully, and sat across from me, her own bowl untouched. She watched as I took the first spoonful, smiling faintly, her hands folded in her lap. The taste was pleasant enough, though strangely bitter at the end, a metallic aftertaste that lingered on the tongue. I asked what she had put in it. She said it was a new spice mix she'd ordered online, something Mediterranean. Halfway through the meal, I began to feel that same faint dizziness that had come a few nights earlier, but stronger this time, a rolling pressure behind my eyes. I tried to mask it, not wanting to alarm her, but she noticed. "You okay, Dad?" she asked softly, leaning forward. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Just a bit tired. Maybe I'll lie down for a while." She offered to help me upstairs, and I refused, too proud to let her guide me like an invalid. My legs trembled slightly as I climbed the stairs, gripping the banister harder than usual. When I reached my bedroom, the edges of the room pulsed faintly, as if the walls were breathing. I sat on the bed until the feeling passed. When I woke an hour later, the light had shifted. The rain had stopped, and the house was utterly still. From downstairs, I could hear the faint sound of running water and the clink of dishes. I went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and noticed something strange. My skin looked pale, almost grayish, and there were faint bruises along my arms, as if I'd bumped into something, though I couldn't recall when. My first thought was that my blood thinner dose was off, but I hadn't changed it. My bottles were in the cabinet where I always kept them. I opened the mirror cabinet and stared. The bottles were neatly aligned again, but the labels seemed wrong. My usual prescription for atenolol had been replaced with something else, a name I didn't recognize. I turned the bottle around, squinting. The pharmacy label had my name, my doctor's name, but the pills inside were oval instead of round. I held the bottle up to the light, heart beating faster. Then I heard her voice from downstairs. "Dad, you awake?" I quickly closed the cabinet and forced my tone steady. "Yes, I'm fine." "Dinner's in an hour," she called. "I'm making your favorite, chicken pot pie." That night I barely touched the food. Melissa noticed and frowned. "You're not eating," she said. "It's not like you. Are you feeling sick again?" I said my stomach was unsettled. She insisted on making me chamomile tea with honey, and I drank it out of politeness, though the smell made my throat tighten. Afterward, she cleared the plates in silence, humming to herself as she moved about the kitchen. I sat at the table, pretending to read the newspaper, watching her reflection in the darkened window. Her movements were precise, efficient, almost mechanical. There was something chillingly calm about the way she scrubbed the dishes, dried them, and rearranged everything in the cupboards as if she were preparing the scene for another act. The next morning I woke up late, groggy, with a dry mouth and a pounding in my chest. I could smell breakfast downstairs, oatmeal, toast, coffee, but the aroma made me nauseous. Melissa came up, cheerful as ever, carrying a tray. "You slept in," she said. "That's good. Rest is what you need." She set the tray on my bedside table, adjusting the napkin as though serving a guest in a hotel. I stared at the bowl of oatmeal, its surface dotted with blueberries arranged in a neat circle. She noticed my hesitation. "You have to eat, Dad. You're losing weight. I can see it in your face." I picked up the spoon and stirred slowly. The oatmeal was warm, smooth, but again, there was that bitterness. I put the spoon down after 2 bites. "Maybe later," I said. Her expression froze for a fraction of a second before she smiled again. "All right, later then," she said. Her tone light, but her eyes didn't match. That afternoon, when she went out to pick up a few things, I decided to test a suspicion I could barely admit to myself. I went to the kitchen and found the stew pot she had used the day before, still drying on the rack. A faint residue clung to the bottom. I scraped a small bit onto my finger and tasted it, just a trace, but enough to leave that same metallic tang on my tongue. I rinsed my mouth immediately, trembling with a fear that felt both absurd and enormous. What was I thinking? That my own daughter would harm me? The thought was monstrous, but so was the feeling in my body, the weakness, the dizziness, the strange bruises that seemed to appear overnight. When Melissa returned, she was in a bright mood, carrying shopping bags filled with groceries and a small envelope she said was from the bank. She handed it to me casually, saying it was just a routine update. Inside was a document authorizing joint access to my savings account, already partially filled out with my name. "It's just for convenience," she said. "In case something happens, you know, if you're hospitalized or something, I can handle the bills." I looked at her, at the faint impatience in her eyes, and said I'd think about it. She shrugged and changed the subject, asking whether I'd like soup or pasta for dinner. I said I wasn't hungry, and she frowned again, that flicker of annoyance breaking through her mask. "You've got to eat, Dad," she said quietly. "You can't just stop." That night I barely slept. Every creak of the house sounded amplified. Every shadow on the wall moved like something alive. Around midnight I heard her footsteps in the hall, slow, deliberate. The door handle turned slightly, paused, then released. I held my breath until I heard her return to her room. When dawn came, I sat up, heart racing, and made a decision I never thought I'd have to make. If I couldn't trust her food, I'd prepare my own. I waited until she went out again, then boiled some eggs, toasted bread, and ate in silence, cleaning up carefully so she wouldn't notice. That afternoon, she seemed unusually attentive, hovering in the kitchen, making tea every few hours, insisting I drink plenty of fluids. When she served dinner, meatloaf and mashed potatoes, she poured the gravy with a deliberate slowness, then placed both plates on the table, one in front of me and one across from her. "Eat up," she said, smiling. I looked at the plates, identical, steaming, aromatic, and a strange calm settled over me, the kind of stillness that precedes a storm. I excused myself, saying I needed to get my reading glasses, and when I returned, I sat down quietly, waited until she was distracted pouring herself water, and switched the plates. It was a small, almost invisible motion, but my hands were steady. I told myself it was ridiculous, but I had to know. We ate in silence, the clink of cutlery filling the room. She finished half her meal before setting down her fork and pressing a hand to her chest. Her face paled, her eyes widening in confusion. I don't feel well," she murmured, standing abruptly. The chair scraped against the floor. Within seconds she was gasping, stumbling toward the sink. I froze, the fork slipping from my fingers. "Melissa," I said, rising, but she couldn't answer. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the kitchen tiles. I rushed to her side, calling her name, shaking her shoulder, but her skin was clammy, her breathing shallow. For a second, the world tilted. My own daughter lying there, eyes unfocused, mouth moving soundlessly. I called 911, my voice trembling, words colliding. "My daughter, she's not breathing right. Please, send someone." The dispatcher's calm voice guided me through the steps. Check pulse, clear airway, but my hands were shaking too badly to do anything properly. Within minutes, though it felt like hours, the paramedics arrived. They lifted her onto a stretcher, asking what she had eaten. I told them we'd had dinner, meatloaf, and potatoes, that she'd started feeling sick right after. One of them nodded, already inserting an IV. As they carried her out, one turned to me and asked if I'd eaten the same meal. I hesitated before answering. "Yes," I said quietly. "The same." But inside, a storm was gathering, a realization so heavy it felt like gravity itself had shifted. When the ambulance pulled away, lights flashing down the dark street, I stood in the doorway, the smell of dinner still hanging in the air, and whispered to the empty house, "Marjorie, forgive me. I think I finally understand." The ambulance had barely turned the corner before the house seemed to inhale and hold its breath, the kitchen chair still crooked from where Melissa had pushed back, the gravy skin congealing in a dull sheen that caught the light like old varnish. And in that suspended quiet, I stood with my hands on the edge of the table and felt the peculiar mix of fear and certainty that comes when a long, shapeless dread finally chooses an unmistakable form. I told myself to move, to do something useful, and found that my body obeyed as if it had been waiting for orders for weeks. So I reached for the plates, forced myself not to rinse them, found 2 clean freezer bags under the sink, and slid the leftovers into them with the care of a man picking up a snake, marking one bag with a strip of masking tape and a shaky A, and the other with M, because something in me believed, with a cold, methodical calm I did not recognize, that proof mattered now, and that memory, mine most of all, would be treated like soft clay under another person's thumb if I didn't bring them something harder to press against than my word. When the paramedics had asked whether we ate the same thing, I had nodded, and technically that was true, because the meatloaf was the same, and the potatoes were the same, but the gravy, which she had poured in that slow, almost ceremonial way was the thing that had carried the taste I kept wanting to call metallic, even though I knew that wasn't precise. And as I labeled the bags, I saw the saucepan on the back burner, its handle angled just so. And I understood, with that same cold clarity, that a person who means to help does not pour from one pan for one plate and from a ladle she keeps near the spice rack for the other. A person who means to help does not hover as you lift your fork with an attention so patient it passes for love, unless you know what love used to feel like. I set the bags in the freezer as if cold could preserve truth as reliably as it preserves soup. Then I went upstairs to the bathroom, opened the cabinet, and looked again at the pill bottles that had been posing as my lifeline all week. The atenolol was still wrong. The antidepressant I never took had reappeared even though I had thrown it away last year after a doctor pushed it on me. For sleep. And my warfarin, my careful, terrifying friend, was now a generic brand I had never seen with a lot number printed in a faint gray that looked like it could be wiped away with a damp finger. I took out my old day-of-the-week organizer, the one I'd stopped using since Melissa began presiding over my medication, like a priest over a sacrament, and found the Tuesday compartment too full and the Wednesday one light, as if time itself had been rearranged to suit someone else's schedule. I should have sat down then, but I didn't, because the thought that stopping would invite all the doubt back into the room terrified me more than the ache in my knees. So I went into Melissa's guest room, which still smelled faintly of her shampoo and that citrus cleaner she used on every surface as if she meant to erase the house's old smell entirely. And I looked not for secrets, but for patterns, because I've learned that secrets hide, but patterns boast. The tote bag she brought from the bank lay half open by the dresser with that envelope she'd called routine, and under it a slim black notebook. Not a diary, there are no diaries anymore, but a planner with squares too small to contain meaning. Just lists, one of them labeled Dad, Utilities, Auto Pay, Doc Apt, House Appraisal, with question marks that read like a conscience trying to pass as prudence. In the side pocket of the tote was a bottle of herbal tincture, thick and dark, labeled Valerian Hops Blend, a thing a well-meaning daughter might use to coax sleep into an anxious household, except the dropper stem was stained not brown, but a faint pink, the color of diluted blood, and the glass smelled faintly medicinal under the sweet plant perfume. And I knew then that if I let these details get away from me, they would be replaced by someone else's, and that someone else would be confident and young and certain, and would look at me with the face people wear when they talk to old men on the record. The phone rang and startled me so badly I almost dropped the notebook. It was the hospital, a nurse whose voice was both trained and kind, asking me to come as soon as I could and to bring a list of Melissa's medications if I knew them, which I did not, because the daughter who had catalogued my life had kept her own in a shadow I had been too grateful to interrogate. I told the nurse I would come at once, hung up, and looked at the house as if it were something that needed me to say goodbye, then pulled the front door closed and heard the deadbolt click with a finality that made me feel, for a second, that I was the one being locked in. The drive was a blur of wet streets and brake lights, my mind rehearsing a conversation I dreaded. How much to tell, how much to keep back. Whether a father could say aloud the sentence that his daughter cooked danger into his dinner without sounding like a man who had lived too long with only clocks for company. At the ER, the fluorescent light sharpened everything into edges. The chairs lined up like an exam I had not studied for. The antiseptic smell that reminded me of the last day I held Marjorie's hand. And behind the admitting desk, a woman who asked me for my name, my relation, and whether I had power of attorney for Melissa in the event decisions needed to be made. A question that might have been routine, but lodged in me like a splinter. Because just hours earlier, she had tried to wedge my own signature under hers to open a door into my savings. And now the world was offering me the mirror image as if to test the elasticity of irony. I said no, I did not, and the woman nodded and typed, and the keys made the dry clatter of rain on tin. A young doctor found me and spoke in that careful cadence they teach you when words can turn to weapons in an instant. Melissa was stable for now, he said. Her blood pressure low, her heart irregular but responding to medication, and they were running panels to see what had disrupted her coagulation. A word that in the doctor's mouth was technical and in mine was fate. He asked what she had eaten, whether she had any allergies, whether she took any blood thinners, and when I said I did, not she, I watched the brief flicker cross his face, a tiny recalibration of suspicion that I felt like a hand against my chest. I answered everything plainly, and when he asked if we had argued, I told him we had not. Which was true if you define arguing as a visible exchange of words, and not as a long siege of small rearrangements until a man no longer recognizes his own kitchen. A police officer arrived, not with the heavy tread of accusation, but with the notebook of procedure. He asked to record my statement, and I agreed because men who refuse look like men who have something to hide. And I had only this house of memory to offer, and I knew its roof was leaking. I told him about dinner, about the suddenness, about calling 911, and I forced myself to stop before I reached the sentence about switching plates, because some truths, released too soon, are like bridges you tested with your toe and then found collapsing under your full weight. Instead, I said I feared my medicines were not my medicines and that my daughter had been helping, and help sometimes confuses the bottles. And I saw in his eyes the sympathy that contains its own suspicion, the kind that says gently, "We will check, sir," because we know the elderly are often bewildered by their pills. He asked if I would consent to a brief search of my kitchen and the collection of any food I thought relevant. And I said yes, grateful suddenly for the unsentimental rigor of forms and bagged evidence and signatures that pinned experience to paper so it could not wriggle away later when lawyers began to define what a father should have noticed. When he left to coordinate that, I sat alone in the corridor, staring at the scuffed line the gurneys had worn into the floor, and felt the first true wave of shame. Because even if what I feared proved right, and even if the law wrote a neat narrative with perpetrators and victims, I would still be the man who had stood in his kitchen and watched his daughter eat from a plate he had maneuvered toward her. A fact that would not bend no matter how I framed it. And I did not know yet that remorse and self-preservation can live in the same chest without canceling one another. That grief can look like a steady voice telling a dispatcher your address, while a darker voice runs the ledger of a lifetime of small betrayals. The nurse returned to say Melissa had been moved to a monitored bed and that I could see her briefly. I followed her down a hall of whispering machines and stopped at a curtain where my daughter lay with a cannula in her nose and a bruise flowering beneath the adhesive on her arm, her skin the color of unbaked dough, her eyelids fluttering in a way that made her look 10 years old again and scared after a nightmare. I stood there and wanted to say her name, but my mouth produced only air. So I let the silence speak and listened to the beep that counted her heart's insistence on continuing. Back home later, the house no longer held its breath. It exhaled a long, tired draft that lifted the corner of a grocery receipt Melissa had left by the toaster. I picked it up without thinking and found that it was not a grocery receipt at all, but a pharmacy printout for vitamin K, Ask Pharmacist, dated 2 days ago, a detail so sharp it cut. because vitamin K is the antidote the body can deploy when blood thinners run too fast through it. And the fact that she had asked about the antidote told me that whatever game she played, she had rehearsed the rules. And that realization brought not rage, but a cold, slow-burning comprehension of intent. On the counter, her phone vibrated, the screen waking to show a message preview because she had turned off the lock the way one does at home, safe among one's own. The text was from her husband, a man I had learned to tolerate as one learns to tolerate a neighbor's leaf blower. And it read, in that clipped bravado of people who have never considered what words look like under fluorescent lights. Any update? How long does it take? We can't keep paying 2 mortgages. Be practical and speed things up. I did not open the thread. I took a photo of the screen with my old flip phone, the camera whining like a toy. And then I set her phone down exactly where it had been, because I understood, now more than ever, that the only safety left to me was accuracy. I emptied the trash carefully and found 2 blister packs from an over-the-counter sleep aid torn open and folded inside a paper towel, a detail easy to explain and easier to misunderstand. And beneath those an empty bottle of the herbal tincture with a dropper stained a little darker now. And I realized I needed an ally, not a neighbor who would shake his head and tell me stories of his own kids, not a priest who would nod and counsel forgiveness, but a pharmacist, a person whose language was numbers and interactions, and who might look at the pills lined up on my counter and tell me whether the story my body had been telling was plausible or the fantasy of a lonely man. I drove to the 24-hour pharmacy by the highway and placed my bottles on the counter in a kind of confession. The pharmacist, a woman with tired eyes and a careful smile, listened as I explained that I feared substitutions had been made, that the generic labels didn't match the shapes, that my bruising was new, that my head swam after meals, and she, without drama, examined lot numbers, shapes, and dosages, then leaned closer and told me that if I had been taking the warfarin in the amounts implied by the day-of-the-week case and also drinking herbal preparations containing coumarin analogs, my blood could indeed be too thin. And if in addition some meals contained ingredients that interfered with the liver's ability to process the drug, the picture I painted was not impossible, but likely. She wrote down a note on the back of a pharmacy bag, the kind of note that later becomes a hinge in a story, and advised me to call my doctor in the morning and, if I felt unwell, to go straight to the ER. When I told her I had already been, that my daughter was there, she grew quiet in the way people do when they suspect the ground beneath your family is not bedrock, but a crust over something hot. Driving home, I felt older than I had in the morning, not because of the hour, but because knowledge is a weight that sits on the chest. And yet under that weight there was a strange steadiness, a sense that I had moved from fog to map. And maps, even of bad country, are better than fog. I locked the door, set the bagged food by the front hall for the officer, stacked the pill bottles in a shoebox like a miser counting chips, and sat at the kitchen table in the chair Melissa had left askew. And for the first time in weeks I let myself cry, not loudly, not even visibly if someone had walked in, but with a deep, slow leak of salt that felt like the body's way of clearing space for what comes next. When dawn came, I was still sitting at the kitchen table, the thin gray light settling across the counters like dust. The shoebox of pill bottles opened beside me, each container lined up like evidence at a trial I could not yet imagine how to win. I had not slept, only drifted through hours that stretched and folded in on themselves, replaying the dinner, the ambulance, the doctor's face as he said coagulation, and the dull thud of my heart when I realized that proof, not truth, was what the world believed in. I poured myself coffee I couldn't drink, its bitterness matching the metallic echo still clinging to my tongue. Outside, the neighborhood moved on as if nothing had happened. The newspaper thudded onto the porch, the neighbors' sprinklers hissed to life. And for the first time in my long life, I understood what it meant to stand completely outside the pattern of the ordinary. My daughter lay in a hospital bed, and I could not decide whether I wanted her to recover so she could explain herself, or not recover so that the explanation would die with her, and I would never have to hear the shape of the thought that had lived behind her eyes while she stirred my food. By mid-morning, the police returned. A different officer this time, older, his voice less bright with procedure. He carried a clipboard, and behind him another man in gloves took photographs of the kitchen and labeled the freezer bags with tidy numbers. The officer asked if I was feeling well, if I'd eaten anything since the incident, and I said no. I hadn't been hungry. He said the hospital had found traces of a strong anticoagulant in Melissa's blood, the same class as my prescription, though in quantities inconsistent with medical use. He paused, waiting to see if I'd flinch, as if expecting me to confess that I'd dosed her in revenge. I kept my voice calm, almost steady, and told him what I knew, that the gravy had been served separately, that I had switched the plates, that I believed the contamination, if that was the right word, had been meant for me. He wrote this down slowly, his pen pressing deep grooves into the paper, and then asked whether I had anyone who could confirm my state of mind before the event. It was a polite way of asking if I was delusional. I told him about the pharmacist, about the pill bottles that didn't match, about the messages on her phone, though I could see skepticism flickering across his face like light behind clouds. I offered the phone to him, explaining how I'd found it, what it said. He examined the screen, photographed it, and returned it without comment. Then he said they'd send the food to a lab, and that I should stay reachable, and that he hoped I'd get some rest. Rest, as if sleep could bleach away what I now knew. After they left, the house felt stripped bare, as if the act of official scrutiny had emptied it of warmth entirely. I wandered through rooms that suddenly looked staged, my own life arranged by a stranger. Every framed photograph seemed to accuse me of something, either of failing to see what Melissa had become, or of seeing it too late. I found myself standing in front of a picture from her wedding day, her hand on her husband's arm, her smile wide and bright. I remembered how proud I'd been that day, how certain that I'd done my duty as a father. Marjorie had whispered that she didn't trust the groom, that his charm felt rehearsed, and I'd laughed it off, saying all men rehearsed their charm when they were young. Looking at that photo now, I realized Marjorie had seen something I hadn't, the same calculating gleam that later surfaced in Melissa's eyes when she thought she was unobserved. I set the photo face down on the shelf, unable to stand their frozen happiness staring back at me. Around noon, the phone rang again. It was the hospital. The nurse said Melissa was conscious and asking for me. For a moment, I couldn't answer. My throat closed up, and I thought of pretending not to be home, but some stubborn instinct pushed me to go. Maybe it was duty, maybe it was the need for the final piece of the puzzle, or maybe I wanted to hear her voice one more time before deciding what to do with the rest of mine. I drove in silence, the car's old engine humming like a low prayer. The hospital parking lot shimmered under a pale sun. Inside, the corridor smelled of antiseptic and loneliness, and the sound of rubber soles squeaking on linoleum followed me to her room. She was propped up in bed, pale but alert, her hair tangled, her eyes wary. When she saw me, something like relief flickered across her face, followed quickly by confusion. "Dad," she said, her voice dry, "you came." I nodded and sat down in the chair by her bed, keeping my hands folded in my lap because I didn't trust them not to shake. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The heart monitor beside her chirped steadily, counting out time in small electric pulses. Then she looked at me, her lips trembling slightly. "They said there was something in my blood," she whispered. "They said it was the medicine you take. How did that happen?" Her tone was not accusation, but inquiry, soft, coaxing, as though she still believed she could write the story faster than I could tell it. I met her gaze and said, "You tell me." The silence stretched. She blinked, looked away, then back again. "Dad, I don't know what you mean." Her fingers plucked at the blanket, twisting the edge until it frayed. "I only wanted to help. You've been forgetting things, mixing up your pills. I was worried. Maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I—" She stopped, her eyes darting toward the door, as if measuring whether someone else was listening. "You didn't make a mistake," I said quietly. "You made a choice. There's a difference." For the first time, she looked frightened. Not of me, but of the calm in my voice. "Dad," she began again, "I was trying to protect you. You've been getting worse. You don't even see it. You call me twice in a day and forget you already did. You told me you left the stove on. I just thought—" "That's not true," I interrupted. "You told people it was. You wanted them to think I was losing my mind. You needed that story, didn't you? It makes what you were doing sound like mercy." Her eyes filled with tears, quick and sudden. "Please," she said. "You don't understand. Thornton said we couldn't keep doing this forever. The bills, the house, everything. It's too much. I thought, if something happened to you, the insurance, the inheritance— Dad, I wasn't trying to hurt you. I swear I just wanted it to be peaceful, quick. You wouldn't even know." The words slid through me like cold water. She covered her face with her hands, shaking, but there was no sobbing, only the dry rhythm of guilt rehearsed too late. I felt no triumph, only a hollow ache. "Peaceful," I repeated. "You were going to make it peaceful." I stood up, feeling older than I had that morning. "Melissa, I need to tell the police what you just said." She lowered her hands, panic flashing across her features. "No, Dad, please. They'll think I'm a monster. You don't want that. You're all I have left." "You had a mother once," I said, the bitterness sharp in my throat. "She would have died all over again if she'd heard you say that." I turned to leave, but her voice stopped me. "Wait," she said, almost shouting now. "It wasn't just me. Thornton knew. He told me what to use, how much. He said he read about it. He said you'd never notice." Her voice cracked. "He said he couldn't stand waiting for you to die naturally." I froze, one hand on the doorframe, the world spinning in slow motion. It wasn't just her. Of course it wasn't. I had seen his influence in her for years, the way she parroted his tone, his dismissive smile. But hearing it confirmed, hearing that he had been the architect of my death disguised as her caretaker, shifted something in me that I couldn't yet name. I turned back and looked at her, my daughter, my only child, the sum of all the years I'd thought were love. "Then you should both be ready to answer for it," I said. She began to sob in earnest then, her face buried in the blanket, and I walked out before she could stop me. Outside the sun was blinding. I stood on the steps for a long time, letting the heat burn away the chill that had settled in my bones. I called the officer handling the case, told him I needed to speak in person. He met me at the station that afternoon, and I told him everything, her words, her confession, the husband's name. He listened, took notes, asked questions that I answered without hesitation. When I finished, he exhaled slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Mr. Pierce," he said, "we'll investigate. We'll need to verify everything. But if what you're saying checks out, this is serious." Serious, as if the word could hold the weight of what had happened. He asked if I felt safe returning home. I laughed then, quietly, the sound startling even to me. "Safe?" I said. "I haven't felt safe in months. I just didn't know why." He nodded, offered to have a patrol car swing by my house at night for a few days, but I waved it off. The only thing I wanted was to sit somewhere still and understand the wreckage of what remained. That evening, I drove to the lake where Marjorie and I used to walk in the summers, the same place where Melissa had once learned to skip stones. The air smelled of pine and algae, and the water was perfectly still, reflecting the pink smear of sunset. I sat on a bench, watching the ripples from a passing duck, and let my mind wander through the years. How had we come to this? Had I been blind, or had love itself acted as a kind of blindness, softening every warning into coincidence? I thought of all the times I had said yes when I should have said no, all the checks I'd written, the small humiliations I'd swallowed because she was my daughter, and I wanted to believe she was good. Love, I realized, isn't just what we give, it's what we permit. And I had permitted far too much. When darkness fell, I drove home. The house waited in silence, patient as a predator. I locked the doors, though I wasn't sure from which side danger might come any more. I sat in my chair by the window, watching the lights of passing cars flicker across the walls. Somewhere inside, a part of me began to harden, not out of hatred, but out of a need to survive the knowledge that forgiveness would be impossible. I thought of Melissa's tears, of her saying peaceful, and I understood that in her mind she had already rewritten the story, cast herself as the caretaker, overwhelmed by circumstances, not the conspirator who had tried to end her father's life. The world would likely believe her version. It always believes the living before it believes the old. But I had something stronger than belief now. I had truth and the strange, steady calm of a man who has nothing left to lose. Before bed, I walked into the kitchen and poured the 2 freezer bags' contents into separate glass jars, labeling them again, this time in careful ink. I set them in the refrigerator, not for the police but for myself, a reminder that sometimes survival is not about strength or faith, but about the single quiet act of noticing when the hand that feeds you is trembling for the wrong reason. Then I turned off the light, stood for a moment in the darkened room, and whispered to the empty air, "Marjorie, I think you'd be proud. I finally learned to see." Before dawn had even bruised the sky, I was awake again, not from rest, but from the same mechanical endurance that had carried me through the last 48 hours, a kind of waking coma in which the body continues, because it does not yet know what to do with the mind's new knowledge. The house was so silent it seemed to be listening, every pipe and floorboard waiting for the smallest gesture to break the tension. And I thought, not for the first time, that silence can be louder than any accusation. I went to the kitchen, the same kitchen where she had stood smiling, her hand steady on the ladle, and made coffee I could not drink. The radio on the counter caught some early morning talk show about real estate and retirement planning, and for a surreal moment I heard Melissa's name in the cadence of the host's patter. Melissa Market, Melissa Mortgage, words twisting into echoes of her voice. I switched it off, poured the untouched coffee down the sink, and stood there gripping the counter until my knuckles went white. I was waiting for the call I knew would come, the one that would confirm the shape of the betrayal in official language, The bureaucratic translation of evil into evidence. It came around 8, a clipped, efficient voice telling me that detectives had visited the husband's workplace early that morning, that he was cooperative and aware of the situation. Phrases that carried the antiseptic distance of men who deal in tragedy for a living. They wanted me to come down to the precinct again to review a few statements. I said I would. When I hung up, the house exhaled, a faint settling sound in the rafters like a sigh of relief, or perhaps resignation. I went upstairs to shave, my hand trembling not from fear, but from exhaustion, the razor skipping once and leaving a thin line of red that stung, but didn't bleed much, my blood too thin, still, from the weeks of tampering. I looked in the mirror and saw not a victim, not even a survivor, but something in between, a man suspended in the space between grief and grim purpose. At the station, the same officer from the previous day greeted me with a nod, his eyes less guarded now, as if some small piece of the story had started to tilt in my favor. He led me into a windowless room with a buzzing fluorescent light that made everything appear slightly drained of color. On the table were a few printouts, a voice recorder, and a small stack of photographs in plastic sleeves. He began by thanking me for cooperating, then said, almost casually, that Melissa's toxicology results matched the contents of my warfarin prescription precisely, right down to the brand of manufacture, dosage, and batch number. They'd confirmed through the pharmacy that a refill had been requested under my name 2 weeks earlier, but picked up by a family member. When they showed the surveillance image, there was no mistaking her, Melissa, her hair tied back, standing at the counter, her signature scrawled beneath mine on the digital pad. They also found something else, he said, a digital record from her phone indicating several searches over the past month, queries about symptoms of accidental warfarin overdose, time until death from blood thinning, can you taste blood thinners in food? My stomach turned at the precision of her research, the cold diligence of it. He paused, watching my reaction, and then slid another photograph across the table, a printout of the text message between her and Thornton. The words were burned into me already, but seeing them in evidence form, the date, the timestamp, the banality of the phrasing, made the reality irreversible. Any update? How long does it take? We can't keep paying 2 mortgages. Be practical and speed things up. The officer didn't need to explain. The message spoke for itself. I asked what would happen next. He said Thornton had been detained for questioning and that Melissa, still under medical supervision, was being kept under guard pending further statements. He reminded me that while her initial confession in the hospital was compelling, it might not stand in court without corroboration. That was where the evidence came in. The bottles, the food samples, the receipts. They would test everything. He told me I might need to testify eventually, that these cases rarely moved quickly, and I nodded, though the word testify sounded absurd in my mouth. What testimony could there be beyond the simple, obscene fact that my own daughter had fed me death in a bowl of soup? When I returned home, the house no longer looked like mine at all. Police tape across the kitchen entryway, fingerprint powder dusted along the cabinet handles, the faint chemical smell of investigative procedure hanging in the air like an unwanted guest. I sat in the living room with the blinds drawn, staring at the muted television. Every channel seemed to echo the same stories: crime, inheritance disputes, family tragedies, and I wondered whether this was how the world always sounded and I had only now tuned in to the frequency. Around noon, a knock at the door startled me. It was the pastor from the small church down the street, a man who had officiated Marjorie's funeral and visited occasionally since. Someone must have told him what had happened. He offered condolences, but his eyes were hungry for the story, the way people are when tragedy happens within reach of their own peace. I gave him nothing but polite fragments. When he left, he placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Forgiveness, Arnold, is a form of strength." I waited until the door closed before whispering, "So is remembrance," though I don't think he would have understood. That evening, I received another call, this time from a detective assigned to follow up on Thornton. They'd executed a search warrant at his office and home. Among the documents found in his desk were unsigned drafts of property listings for my house, correspondence with a financial advisor about anticipated assets upon estate transition, and an insurance policy that listed Melissa as the beneficiary of a family trust set to activate upon my death. My name appeared in the policy as the insured party, though I had never seen or signed anything resembling it. Forged signatures again, most likely, but effective ones. The detective said the evidence suggested premeditation extending over several months, possibly longer. I thanked him for telling me, though gratitude was far from what I felt. After he hung up, I sat in the dim kitchen with the phone still in my hand and realized that what I was experiencing was not shock anymore, but something colder. A steady, methodical anger that did not flare, but smoldered, the kind that survives even after grief has burned itself out. For the next few days, the house became a revolving door of officials, each carrying their own tone of detachment. Forensic technicians, social workers, a representative from Adult Protective Services, who spoke gently about elder safety, as if I were a child. I answered every question, signed every paper, and learned to translate their language into plain speech. Victim support meant pity, case management meant delay, and closure was a word people used when they could not bear to say end. Through it all, I kept to my routines as best I could, watering the plants, sorting mail, pretending that the smell of disinfectant was just another phase of life. At night, I dreamed of the lake again, but in the dream the water was red, rippling outward from something unseen beneath the surface. 3 days later, the officer called again. "Mr. Pierce," he said, "there's something you should know. Thornton has admitted to involvement. He says the idea started as a joke, but it went further. He claims Melissa misunderstood him, that he never intended harm. But he also admitted to researching the same substances, ordering them online, and keeping them in their house. We found the bottles." I closed my eyes, listening to the rhythm of his voice, steady, professional. He might as well have been reading a weather report. "They're both being charged," he continued. "Attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery. It's going to court." I thanked him again, hung up, and sat there for a long time staring at the floor. It should have felt like relief, but what I felt instead was an emptiness so vast it bordered on peace. That night, I took out Marjorie's old photo albums, something I hadn't done in years. The pages crackled softly as I turned them, each photograph a fragment of a life that had once seemed unbreakable. There was Melissa at 5, in a Halloween costume with a crooked halo. Melissa at 12, holding a science fair ribbon. Melissa at 20, laughing with her mother in the backyard. I traced her face with my thumb and wondered where exactly the fracture had begun. People like to believe evil arrives suddenly, that it knocks once at the door, and you can choose whether to let it in, but I knew better now. It starts as a whisper in the mind, a small justification that grows fat on repetition until it becomes truth. She hadn't woken up one morning and decided to kill me. She had walked there step by step, over years of small selfishnesses I had forgiven, because that's what love does. It forgives until there's nothing left to forgive with. Days blurred together. I went back to the hospital once, at the detective's request, to sign a statement. I saw her again, behind a glass partition this time, a nurse stationed nearby. She looked smaller somehow, the defiance gone, replaced by a quiet resignation. When our eyes met, she mouthed something I couldn't hear. Maybe sorry, maybe help. I didn't move. There was nothing to be done. The law would handle what the heart no longer could. When I left, the nurse handed me a sealed envelope she said Melissa had asked to be delivered. I waited until I was home to open it. Inside was a single page, handwritten in her familiar looping script. "Dad," it began, "I don't expect you to understand. Thornton said things that made sense at the time. I thought I was doing something merciful, something practical. I thought you were suffering. I thought maybe it would be easier for you and for me. I was wrong. Please don't hate me. I never stopped being your daughter. I just lost my way." The letter ended without a signature, just a small stain in the corner where a teardrop had fallen and dried. I folded it carefully and placed it inside one of the albums, beside a picture of her as a child, because that was the version of her I wanted to remember, the one untouched by ambition, the one who had once called me her hero. As the investigation dragged on, neighbors began to avoid my eyes. Word had spread, of course. In small towns, it always does. Some offered condolences, others curiosity thinly disguised as sympathy. The mailman lingered longer than usual, pretending to adjust the envelopes just to get a look at me. I felt like a ghost haunting my own neighborhood. But I endured it the way you endure a fever. You know it must break eventually. What surprised me most was how quickly the machinery of justice moved once public interest waned. Within weeks, the hearings were set. I was asked to provide a formal statement for the record, which I did in one sitting without edits or emotion. I read it once aloud before mailing it. A simple account of what had happened, who had done what, and why. No commentary, no speculation, no plea for pity. Just the bare truth, stripped of all decoration. One evening near the end of summer, I received another call from the detective. The trials were moving forward. Melissa's lawyer was exploring a plea deal based on diminished capacity, stress, grief, financial desperation. Thornton was pursuing the same strategy, blaming her instability and claiming he'd been manipulated. The detective asked how I felt about that, as if my opinion could weigh against the calculus of law. I told him that whatever story they needed to tell themselves didn't matter to me anymore. The truth had already been spoken. "You're remarkably calm about all this," he said. I thought for a moment before answering. When you spend your life trusting people you love, and they try to end that life, there's only two directions left to go: madness or clarity. I've chosen clarity. After the call, I sat outside on the porch, watching the stars creep out one by one. The air smelled faintly of rain and lilacs from the neighbor's yard. Somewhere down the street a dog barked, then fell silent. I realized that for the first time in months, I was not afraid. Not of death, not of loneliness, not of the memories that still stalked the corners of the house. The worst had already been named, and once a thing is named, it loses its power to terrify. I thought of Marjorie again, of her steady kindness, her unshakable moral compass, and I wondered what she would have said to all this. Probably something simple, like, "You did what you had to." She always believed in quiet justice, the kind that doesn't announce itself but endures. The next morning I went to the garden, the one she had loved, and began to pull weeds. The soil was damp from the night's rain, and the smell of earth rose like something alive. As I worked, I found myself speaking softly, not praying exactly, but conversing with the air, with her, with whatever part of myself had survived. I told her the truth of it, every small, awful detail, and when I was done, I felt lighter, though the weight of what had happened would never leave entirely. By noon, I was back inside, the house quiet again, and on the table lay the letter, the photographs, and the police papers. I gathered them all into a folder and locked it in the drawer. I decided that day that once the trial was done, I would sell the house and move somewhere smaller, somewhere where my name meant nothing, where no one would look at me with that mix of pity and fascination reserved for people whose families have turned into headlines. In the weeks that followed, I began to plan quietly, sorting through decades of possessions, deciding what to keep and what to let go of. It struck me how many objects lose their meaning once the people attached to them are gone. The china set Marjorie loved, the handmade cradle we built for Melissa, the collection of postcards from places we never visited, all of it suddenly weightless. I packed what mattered into 3 boxes, photographs, a few letters, and the pocket watch that had belonged to my father. Everything else I donated. As the rooms emptied, the house grew lighter, as if shedding its own guilt. One afternoon, while I was boxing books in the study, the phone rang again. It was Melissa's lawyer. He said she wanted to see me one last time before the sentencing. I told him I would think about it, but even as I said it, I knew the answer. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been spoken through actions. I thanked him and hung up. Later that night, I sat by the window and watched the reflection of my face merge with the darkness outside, and I realized that what I felt wasn't vengeance or victory. It was the quiet, mournful relief of a man who has finally reached the end of a terrible story and survived long enough to tell it. The day of the sentencing came dressed in ordinary weather, which somehow made it worse, because tragedy ought to have clouds or thunder, something theatrical to match the scale of what had been lost. Instead, there was only a mild September morning, the air faintly cool, the sky a pale and indifferent blue, the kind of day when people mow their lawns and talk about football. I sat on the edge of the bed, buttoning my shirt with hands that no longer trembled, not because I was calm, but because I had moved past nerves into the flat, mechanical precision of acceptance. The courthouse was 20 minutes away, a squat building of beige concrete that looked more like a bank than a place where lives were measured and weighed. I drove there alone, refusing the detective's offer of an escort because a man should walk into his final reckoning under his own power. Inside, the corridors were hushed, the air-conditioned chill settling into my bones. The trial itself had been short. There had been confessions, evidence, and no more denials left to twist meaning out of words. Today was only about the verdict and the sentencing, but even knowing that, my heart thudded in slow, deliberate beats, as if marking the last few pages of a long book. I found my seat behind the barrier, close enough to see her profile as she sat at the defendant's table, her hair pulled back, her wrists resting loosely in her lap. She looked thinner, older, her skin drawn tight around the bones of her face. Thornton sat beside her, staring straight ahead, the bland mask of a man who had convinced himself he was unlucky, not guilty. When the judge entered, everyone rose, and I felt the absurd urge to laugh, because the ritual of it all, the rising, the scripted words, felt like something from another era, something that belonged to people who still believed justice had a voice deeper than the one inside their own hearts. The prosecutor summarized the facts with the cold elegance of a man doing a difficult job well. He spoke of financial motive, of deliberate research, of forged documents and altered medication. He used words like betrayal of trust and calculated endangerment. The defense lawyer followed, speaking softly about emotional strain, mental instability, stress, desperation. He used words like caregiver burnout, confusion, and grief. The two narratives floated in the air, incompatible, and yet both somehow too small to contain the immensity of what had really happened, the slow corrosion of love until it turned poisonous. When it came time for the victim impact statement, the judge looked toward me. I stood, every joint in my body protesting, and walked to the small wooden podium at the front of the room. The microphone squealed faintly as I adjusted it. I could feel their eyes on me, the reporters, the jurors, the strangers who had wandered in out of curiosity. And beyond them, Melissa's gaze, steady, waiting. I had rehearsed 100 versions of what I might say, all of them eloquent in the silence of my house. But now that I was here, I realized words were too thin for what I carried. Still, I spoke, my voice low and even. "I'm not here to ask for mercy," I began. "I've had mercy most of my life, and it taught me the wrong lessons. I'm here to tell you what happens when love goes blind in one direction. My daughter didn't grow up cruel. She grew up loved. She grew up trusted. She was my reason for getting up in the morning after her mother died. But somewhere along the line, she learned that affection can be a kind of weapon if you use it carefully enough. I don't know when that started. Maybe it was small at first, a lie about money, a favor that became a habit. But I didn't see it because I was too busy remembering the child she used to be. When you're old, people call that forgiveness. I see now it was denial. I paused, letting the quiet settle again. "She tried to kill me," I said simply, the words heavier than I expected. "She mixed my own medicine into my food and smiled while she did it. She would have sat through my funeral and told people I went peacefully. But I didn't die, and now she has to live knowing that I know who she became. That's her punishment, whether you call it prison or not. The man sitting next to her taught her how to value things in dollars instead of hours, and I suppose that's punishment enough too. I don't hate them. Hatred takes energy I no longer have. But I will never forgive them, because forgiveness is a kind of permission, and I won't give that permission again." I turned slightly then, just enough to meet her eyes. She was crying, silent, her hands clenched in her lap. Thornton sat stone-faced, unrepentant. I looked back at the judge. "Whatever sentence you give them will outlast me anyway. I only came here to make sure the truth was said aloud once, in a room that keeps records." Then I stepped back and returned to my seat, every step feeling both heavier and lighter, as if I had laid down something I'd been carrying for years. The judge's words came later, deliberate even. 25 years for Thornton, 20 for Melissa, with eligibility for parole in 12. There were gasps from the audience, murmurs, the shuffle of papers. I heard none of it. The sound receded into a dull hum. The only thing I saw was her face as the bailiff moved to escort her away. She looked at me once more, and for an instant I saw not malice, but bewilderment, the disbelief of someone who had thought herself immune to consequence. She opened her mouth, perhaps to speak, but no sound came, and then she was gone, swallowed by the machinery of justice. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered like crows, microphones thrust forward, voices blending into one long question I didn't intend to answer. I kept walking, through them, past the parking lot, until I reached the far side of the street where the noise dulled into distance. The air smelled faintly of exhaust and early autumn leaves. I sat on a bench and let the silence return, heavy but clean. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell struck the hour. I thought then of all the people who had tried to tell me that closure was possible, that healing followed confession the way dawn follows night. They were wrong. There is no healing, not from something like this. There is only adaptation. You learn to live beside the wound, to build your days around it. You learn to keep breathing because breath is the last stubborn proof that you still belong to the world. And maybe that's enough. When I drove home, the light had shifted, the sky the color of tarnished brass. The house waited, unchanged, the same dent in the couch, the same photograph of Marjorie by the window. I walked through it slowly, touching the walls as if reacquainting myself with an old language. In the kitchen, I stopped at the table where it had all begun, the place of the meal, the exchange of plates, the silent pivot of fate. I sat down and folded my hands, the smell of memory thick in the air. For a long time, I said nothing. Then I whispered, not to anyone, but the space itself. It's done. But even as I said it, I knew that done was a word too simple for what remained. Justice had been served, yes. But justice is not the same as peace. Peace requires forgetting, and forgetting is a luxury I no longer possessed. Still, as night gathered outside, I felt something close to balance, an equilibrium between pain and endurance. I took out the old fountain pen Marjorie had given me on our 20th anniversary in a clean sheet of paper. I began to write a new will, the ink flowing steadily, my hand sure. The house would go to the church for use as a shelter. The savings would be split among local charities. Everything else, clothes, furniture, books, would be left to whomever needed them. Nothing for Melissa, nothing for Thornton, not out of vengeance but clarity. They had already taken enough of my life. They would take no more. By the time I finished, the moon had risen, pale and distant. I folded the pages neatly and placed them in an envelope, sealing it with wax as I used to when letters meant something. Then I poured myself a glass of water, sat back, and let the quiet settle over me like an old coat. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, whispering the kind of sound that could almost be mistaken for forgiveness if one were foolish enough to listen for it. I closed my eyes and didn't pray, not exactly. I just said her name, Marjorie, once softly, and let the echo fill the room until there was nothing left but breath. The months that followed unfolded with the slow inevitability of a tide, not dramatic, not merciful, but steady in its insistence that life, whatever shape it has left, must go on. The newspapers stopped calling after a few weeks. The neighbors eventually found new topics to gossip about, and the court files, once the heartbeat of my days, sank into the archives where tragedies are flattened into case numbers and signatures. The silence that returned to my house was different now. Not the heavy silence of waiting, but a thinner, clearer quiet, the kind that comes after a storm has stripped the trees bare. I began to walk again in the mornings, the same route Marjorie and I used to take when the world still felt dependable, past the post office, the church, and the park where children shouted across the swings. At first, people crossed the street when they saw me, unsure whether to offer sympathy or avoidance. Later, they simply nodded, and I nodded back, a silent agreement that some stories are better left unspoken once the ending is public. The seasons changed without ceremony. Winter came with a dry kind of cold that made the house creak and my joints ache, but I welcomed it because it dulled the noise in my head. I spent the short days reading the books I had once promised to finish when I had more time, and discovered that time, when it stretches without purpose, loses its flavor. Still, I read. I cooked simple meals. I wrote letters to no one, letters addressed to Marjorie, sometimes even to Melissa, though I never sent them. Writing became a habit, a quiet ritual of remembering without forgiveness. I told myself I did it to stay sharp, to keep language alive in a house where no one answered back. Yet sometimes I caught myself imagining that the words reached them somehow, that somewhere beyond the boundaries of comprehension, they could hear me trying to make sense of what remained. In early spring, I decided to sell the house. The realtor, a polite woman half my age, walked through each room with a professional detachment I admired. She complimented the light, the space, the condition of the floors, not knowing that every board she praised had once been a witness. I watched her take photographs, her reflection flickering across the windows, and realized that by the time strangers moved in, none of it would matter. The kitchen where my daughter had nearly killed me would become a place for Sunday pancakes. The living room where I'd sat through nights of doubt would host birthdays and laughter. The thought didn't sicken me. It relieved me. Evil, I understood now, doesn't haunt spaces. It haunts memory, and memory is something I could carry elsewhere. I moved into a modest retirement community on the edge of town, a place with quiet hallways and the smell of antiseptic that comforted more than it repelled. The staff were kind without intrusion, the meals bland but predictable, and the rhythm of the days simple enough to dull the edges of thought. I found a small group of residents who played cards in the evenings, and though I never joined in, I liked sitting nearby, listening to the soft murmur of their banter, the harmless arguments about rules, the laughter that followed losses too small to wound. They didn't ask about my family, and I didn't volunteer. Among old people, discretion is the highest form of respect. We all carry ghosts, and we all know better than to compare them. Once a month, I received updates from the parole board. Thornton's appeal was denied. Melissa's had been postponed twice. I read the notices without reaction, folded them neatly, and placed them in a drawer. I no longer felt anger when I saw her name, only a distant curiosity, like remembering a stranger from a dream. The bitterness had drained away, leaving something quieter in its place, a kind of moral scar tissue. Sometimes, when I walked in the garden behind the facility, I thought of her as a child again, her small hand gripping mine as we crossed the street. Memory, I discovered, has no conscience. It will summon tenderness even when you've sworn to hate. One evening, near the anniversary of Marjorie's death, I visited the lake again. It was just as we had left it, still, pale, unbothered by the wreckage of human intention. I sat on the same bench watching the reflection of the clouds ripple on the water, and for the first time in a long while, I spoke aloud. "It's over now," I said quietly. "They're where they belong. I'm where I need to be." The words didn't feel triumphant, only true. I stayed until dusk, until the air thickened with the smell of wet earth and pine, and when I rose to leave, I found that my steps were lighter than they had been in years. Back in my small apartment, I began writing again, this time not letters, but a kind of account, a careful telling of what had happened, not for sympathy, not for the police, but for whoever might one day need to understand how such things unfold. I wanted to leave behind something honest, something stripped of melodrama and justification. I titled it The Quiet Poison, not because I thought the phrase clever, but because it described everything too perfectly. The invisible seep of betrayal, the slow corrosion of love, the way death can begin long before breathing stops. I wrote for months until my hands cramped and my eyes blurred, and when I finished, I printed a single copy and locked it in the bottom drawer with my will. It was not revenge. It was record-keeping. Now, in the evenings, I sit by the window and watch the sun sink behind the line of trees, the glass catching the last light like a promise I no longer need to keep. I have learned that justice and peace are not siblings. They barely recognize each other. Justice is public, procedural, announced in courtrooms and newspapers. Peace is private, earned in the quiet afterward when no one is watching. I will never see her again, And that is as it should be. The world has its own way of balancing ledgers. Sometimes I imagine Marjorie beside me, her voice low, teasing, asking if I'm proud of myself for surviving. I tell her I'm not proud, only grateful. Survival, after all, is just what happens when dying fails. She would have laughed at that, I think, softly, shaking her head, telling me I've grown morbid in my old age. Maybe she's right. But there's a strange kind of grace in knowing how much darkness a person can live through without turning entirely to stone. I may never forgive, but I have stopped wishing for different endings, and that, I think, is its own kind of absolution. Tonight, before I go to bed, I'll leave the window open. The spring air smells faintly of lilac, and somewhere in the distance, a train moves through the valley, its whistle long and low, the sound of the distance made into music. I close my eyes and let it pass through me, the noise and the silence afterward, and I realize that what remains is not sorrow, but space, empty, wide, almost gentle. It is the space where love once lived, and where perhaps something like forgiveness might one day quietly return, not as permission, not as weakness, but as the simple acknowledgement that even the deepest wounds eventually stop bleeding. And when they do, what's left is only life, small and fragile, but still mine to keep.